Hey everybody, how's everybody doing today? Thank you for joining me on 365 movies in 365 days, and my name is Jose. So in today's episode, we are talking the 1958 classic A Night to Remember, which is about the sinking of the Titanic. We're also going to talk about a couple different subjects that at first glance might not seem like they, are directly related to the movie, but they actually do once you kind of go digging deeper, not necessarily into the details of the Titanic sinking, but when you start applying critical thinking as to what happened to the people who were actually on the ship. So, as always, let me ask you a question at the start of the show. If you were on the Titanic, okay? You are, on that maiden voyage, and you're on the ship, and you are in either one of two different rooms. In room A, you are with a loved one. The water is, filling in. Let's say you're a third class, person, and so you're trapped below. They haven't let you up. You're in there with your loved one, and water is rising into the room, and you're going to die, okay? In room number 2, same scenario, except for you're with a stranger this time. Which one do you think it's worse? I know it's a pretty heavy question to ask, but think about it, okay? And we'll go over it after we talk about the movie itself as to what I think the answers to both these questions are, at least from my point of view, and maybe help you guys, try to decide and answer that question with you. I also want you to keep a couple other questions in mind, all right? Does it matter who the other person is? And what I mean by that is, does it make a difference, especially with a loved one, whether it's going to be a spouse, a parent maybe, or a child? Does that influence that answer that you give? Number 2, on the stranger side, would it impact you how you connect with that stranger? Do you think it might bring you closer? And I don't mean like anything weird. I'm talking about now you both have something common that's about to happen to you. At that moment, what happens? What's the dynamic of that? What would be the last thing you would say, not only to the stranger, but to your loved one? Now, that one's a hard question. Let's say the water is right up to your noses. You're both hanging on for dear life for air. What do you say at that moment? That's got to be tough, right? Does it change, or do you say anything if you're in that room with that stranger? What do you say? So I want you to keep those type of questions in mind as we go through today's episode, because I want you to think about that, because it's something that I don't think when we watch epic movies sometimes that we put much thought into it, is what happens if we were in it. And that's really what today's episode is really about, putting ourselves in the shoes of others. And it's not just to feel sorry for them, but to know how we would react. Now we're not all going to end up on a boat someday where it's going to, hit an iceberg and kill us all. That isn't going to happen, but, disasters do happen. And it's sometimes something to keep in the mind that it can happen to you. So let's get on with the show. So right here at the top of the show, what I want to do first is I want to talk about the actual movie. So look, at this point in life, unless you're under a certain age, which I'm going to say is maybe 13, 15, 16, you're not going to know who or what the Titanic was unless you watch the movie. It's one of those disasters that unfortunately I think is kind of being lost, because there's been so many other big disasters since then that the idea of the unsinkable ship has kind of disappeared from the conscience of many people if it wasn't for the movie. So the movie is from 1958, which seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? 1958, I mean, it's in black and white. And it's actually based on a book. The book was named A Night to Remember also, as to what the Titanic was. At that time, the Titanic had been, some 40 years in the past. So it was one of those events that had slowly started to kind of drift out of people's consciousness. And there was actually a movie that had been made just a few years before that kind of brought it to the forefront again. And then here comes his book, and people were like, oh, well, let's find out more about Titanic. It hasn't really left our conscience since then. It's always been right there in our culture world that it was one of the most disastrous events ever, and it was also one of the lessons in mankind's history about believing too much in yourself. And by the way, if you have never read A Night to Remember, as a book, it is a fantastic book. It's one that I really recommend. It is really, really gripping. It doesn't do what the James Cameron movie did, which is stick on this love story, blah, blah, blah. It tries to stick to the details, and it doesn't have any one central character. Instead, it just pivots from one person's to the next, to the next, to the next. So it gives you a broad range. It doesn't try to be this is the Jack and Rose show, It was directed by a director named Roy Ward Baker. Now, Roy Ward Baker wasn't necessarily the most talented director. He directed for a very long time, though. I actually first heard of him because he actually directed one of my all-time favorite horror movies, Quatermass and the Pit, for Hammer Films in the late 60s. And so he was a comparable director. He could get the job done, and on this movie he got the job done. The main star of this movie is Kenneth More. Now, this is where the book and the movie kind of split apart, in that in the book there is no central character, like I said. In the movie, on the other hand, Kenneth More's character is the central character. Now, I want to put out a big spoiler alert right now. In case you have never seen Titanic, you have never seen A Night to Remember, if for some reason you're living under a rock and you have never even heard of Titanic, then what's about to happen might shock you, okay? But we are going to actually talk about what happened. Now, I'm going to talk about the events kind of related to the movie itself. Now, does me going over it take away from you watching the movie? Not at all. In fact, I really do recommend you watch the movie. It is a great movie, and it's different from the Titanic, but we'll talk about that in a little while as to which one do I prefer and why. I'm pretty sure you probably know which one I'm already going to say that I prefer, but you never know. So, when did this take place? When did the Titanic sink? It actually took place in 1912, which today is 2019. So it's been more than 100 years since it sank, which is amazing, And it was thought to be unsinkable. I mean, that's the big thing about the ship, is that, hey, was the unsinkable ship, it was the biggest ship in the world. There's no way this could ever sink, and it sunk on its maiden voyage. That's the other thing that is amazing about this, is that it didn't sink like, 3 years, 5 years down the line. No, the first time out on sea, boom, the bitch goes down, The actual time frame is actually not that long either. It only sailed out on April 10th from, England, and it was on its way to New York. And on April 14th in the evening, going into April 15th early morning, is when all the drama happened. So it didn't even really get that far into its voyage when it sank. Now, the big thing about the movie is that it portrays, like I said, a kind of more truthful version of the way things happened, and that's where I'm going to kind of run over. So here's this ship, okay? It is the biggest ship known to man at that point. It was being called the Unsinkable ship, which is, of course, you might as well chalk it up and say, yep, this ship is going down. When you start naming things, the Unsinkable, this can't break, well, it's gonna break, Captain Edward Smith, who was the captain on the ship, had actually been warned that, hey, there are icebergs ahead. You need to check out for those. However, he did something incredibly stupid. He didn't slow down. And what the impact of that was is, let's say it's like, have you ever driven down in a car at, like, let's say 120 miles an hour, and then suddenly something jumps out at you? Guess what's going to happen? You're not going to be able to avoid it. You're going to ram right into that object. Well, that's what happened. Here he's going as fast as he can because they're trying to set, new records and shit. And here comes this big iceberg, and they plow right into the thing. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Now, the SS Californian, who had been out there with the Titanic, had sent a few warnings that, hey, we see ice, and tries to warn the Titanic and says, you need to be careful because that ice is out there. Well, guess what happens? They ignore it. For many reasons, and this is where it gets kind of controversial as to who was really at fault. Some of the radio operators had actually gotten messages saying, hey, you need to be careful about the ice. But they had so many other types of messages coming through that they got buried, and so no one really ever saw what the messages were or how serious the problem was. The Titanic hits the iceberg. People think it's funny. They're carrying around big chunks of ice. But some people on board actually knew that the problem was bigger. They started going out there and asking questions. Thomas Andrews, who was one of the passengers on the ship, was the actual guy who built it. And not right away, but almost within a little bit of time after seeing some of the damage, he said, yep, this ship is going down in 2 hours. Imagine what that must have felt like. Here you are, you're the guy who builds the ship that can't sink, and it's going to sink. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? I mean, I can't even imagine. The fact that he didn't kill himself before the ship, went down is amazing, but he went down with the ship. He went down with his creation, and he knew enough about it that, he knew that the point where it was, beyond saving. So the other thing that Thomas Andrews also knew is, and this is probably good on his part that he didn't survive, because he probably would have been, strung up anyways, is that he realized that it also didn't have enough lifeboats. For the amount of people who were on that ship, there were too little lifeboats. And there's been controversial, accounts as to why that is. Did they just really think that the ship would never go down? So why the hell, if the ship is never going to go down, why do we need these damn lifeboats for? They're just going to gum up the works. For whatever reason, they just didn't have enough. And even some of the ones that they did have, they sent out half empty. They didn't even fill them up because, again, the thing is, in the movie, they portray this really accurately. Some of the people didn't take the situation very seriously. They thought it was all fun and games. Oh, I'm not going to wear that life basket. It's going to ruin me. It's beneath me. Some people just did not take the situation serious enough. So when life, boats actually did need to be used, they were being sent down, half full. Well, guess what happens? Panic ensues, of course. After they hit the iceberg, there's lots of things that the crew tried to do to try to get help. The first thing is they, of course, sent out an SOS. But they were sending out distress signals. They even sent out flares up in the sky to try to get somebody's attention. The amazing thing is that they tried to signal the Californian. However, the Californian's radio operator had already gone off duty because he wasn't expecting any messages. So the Titanic was sending messages, but no one was listening. And it's amazing, because the Californian was only 10 miles away. The disaster wouldn't have been a disaster had the Californian, operator been awake and listening. They probably would have saved most people. Now, there are going to be some people who died because not everybody died going down with the ship. Some people died of other reasons. But the amount of people who were lost probably would have been a lot less had that radio operator been awake. Now, can you imagine if that was you? If they came to you and said, yeah, because you decided you wanted to go to sleep, all these people died. I can't imagine how that guy must have felt. The guilt that must have been, on his head because he went ahead and went to sleep because, he thought his job was done. Now, there were many ships who did get the distress signal. One of them was the RMS Carpathia. Am I saying that right? Carpathia? I believe I'm saying that wrong. But if I'm saying that wrong, don't hold that against me. Promise me, okay? Anyways, it gets a message saying, hey, yeah, we'll go rescue you, but we're 58 miles away and it's going to take us 4 hours. Which again, gives you some idea of how close the Californian was. It was only 10 miles away. And this other ship is almost 60 miles away and it would have taken 4 hours. You start doing the math and it took 2 hours for the ship to sink. Basically, it would have been there way before it sunk. Again, going back to that radio operator, can you imagine the guilt? So the other thing that, like I said, that they were doing was that they were sending out flares up into the sky, every half hour, they would send the flares. The crew on the Californian couldn't understand why they were sending flares up in the sky, because at that time, the use of flares was not considered standard rescue, maneuvers, I guess you could say. And so the Californian crew were like, they keep shooting flares. They must be signaling somebody, maybe another ship within the company, you know? And instead of trying to, you know, figure out what the hell is going on, they just kind of stand around. Again, more people who kind of feel like shit probably after, you know, everything went down. Now, on the Titanic itself, you know, so that it's hit the iceberg, it's going down. Lifeboats are not only being sent out half empty, but then there's that added thing about, you know, women and children first, right? Women and children first are supposed to go down. On one side of the Titanic, that's what was going on. Women and children only. On the other side, some men were sneaking on. Now, if you're one of those men who survived, do you feel like shit? Probably, but some of these people were ruthless assholes who probably didn't, you know, give a damn. They're surviving. That's what they do, you know? Hell with women and children. I have to live. I have to go to this stock market the next day or whatever bullshit that they come up with. But that's what happened, is that on one side, you know, the things that we hold dear, that women and children are supposed to be saved, was happening, and on the other side, they didn't give a damn. In the movie, there is this really crucial point that happens that I really want to kind of point out, and it has nothing to do with the facts of the Titanic sinking or anything, but it's something that is not only shown in A Night to Remember, it's also shown in the Titanic itself, the movie with, you know, Leonardo. There were people who were putting their loved ones on those lifeboats, and they knew that they would never see them again. They were putting their loved ones onto that, knowing that they were going to go to be safe, but they themselves were not. Imagine how hard that must have been, you know? And we'll talk about it in a second, about that, but that must have been horrendous. The amount of torture to do that, because no one, let me tell you, you can be as noble as possible, but no one wants to sacrifice themselves. They will do it. They will sacrifice themselves for the betterment of those that they love. But nobody really wants to do it. I mean, if given a choice, you'd rather not. You'd rather, you know, everybody survive, right? I mean, wouldn't it be great if everybody got off board safely? Isn't that what you would choose over, hey, let me die and my family's gonna grow up without me? But that's what happened. The other thing that is also really well known about the story has to do with the fact that they kept the third-class passengers locked down for as long as they could. Of course, first class, second class gets off first. Third class, these are the rats infested, you know, of the ghettos. You know, these are the people that, you know, the first class people turned up their noses to. With contempt. They didn't like any of these people. They were the last ones. And of course, by the time that they got out there, most of the lifeboats were gone. And most of the deaths on the Titanic were people who were part of the third class, which is horrific and at the same time not very unsurprising, because of course they were going to be the ones who were mostly going to die, because society didn't value any of them. They didn't care. I'm surprised they even let them on the ship to begin with, but they did, and they were the first ones who died, because as the ship started going down and filling up with water, it went from the bottom on to the top. So of course, you know, the ship sinks and 1,500 people lost their lives. Only 705 people survived. Let that sink in. 1,500 people lost their lives. That's a lot of people. And A Night to Remember mostly holds to the events that I just recalled. It didn't try to add this weird sexual tension between this guy who's, you know, third class and this first class person, like, you know, the James Cameron movie. It didn't try to add anything else that wasn't already there. It tried to stick clear to the path that I just laid. That, you know, it was the unsinkable ship. They hit the iceberg, even though they had plenty of warnings to slow down. The ship went down. There was help not that far away, but that help didn't, you know, show up. There was a lot of, let's get from point A to point B, point C. But it's really well done. So let's talk about those questions that I asked you at the beginning of the episode. You have the two choices, and I'll tell you first why I have these questions, okay? And why we have two choices. I had watched A Night to Remember. I had watched it years ago and I enjoyed it, and so I recently thought, well, let me watch it again, see if my feelings have changed in any single way, and it really hasn't. But I also had seen Titanic not too long ago and thought, this one's a little bit better than I remember it just as well. But when in comparing the two movies, you realize that there are two different types of movies. Yes, they both at the core tell the sinking of the ship, and they mostly kind of go about it in the same direction, okay? It, gets filled up with people, hits an iceberg, and sinks. But it's how it gets about to doing that where the two movies really are different. Titanic is mostly a love story, as where A Night to Remember, it's really a telling of a real life event as close as possible without trying to make it over dramatic, basically. And so the idea really started to pour into my head because I wanted to do an episode on the movie. I thought this would be a great movie to kind of either review or look over or to try to explore in some way. So as I started digging into what I wanted to say or how I felt about A Night to Remember, this idea about the people who didn't have any voice in their own survivor kept popping up. But the more I thought about that and the third class struggle to get to the top, the more I started thinking, what happens if you are on that third class and you realize, you know what? I'm going to die. There is no way, they're not going to let us up. We're going to die. And you're just going to accept that fact. So under which scenario would be a better way to go? And that's kind of where it started all leading in my head as to why I wanted to do this episode and then asking these specific questions. So let's kind of break it down, okay? So in choice 1, I said you get to die with a loved one, being a child, a spouse, or a parent. Does it make a big difference? Well, I think it does, because especially with a child, that's got to be the worst one. And then I would think it would be the spouse, and then the last one, the parent. Not because, but see, this is where it kind of gets into that dynamic. For you, it's bad, right? And for you, it's going to be, let's say a child's the worst. But let's say you decide, that you want to go the easiest of the three, which would be to have your parent as the loved one. Well, for you, it's a parent, but remember, for them, you're the child. So while for you, it's the easiest way out of the three, for them, it's the hardest one. So you start kind of playing into that. There's going to be a lot of feelings. The water is floating, the room is filling up with the water. There's a lot of things that are going to happen. The thing is that the hard part about the first choice is that no one wants to see a loved one die, regardless of who it is. Even if it's like, let's say a friend, nobody wants to see that happen. And nobody wants to see somebody else watch you die too. I mean, imagine if, let's say, as it's filling up and the ship is tilting, something knocks you on the head and you're out. Now your child is in that room by themselves, really, scared, frightened, and water's pouring over. There's no one there to comfort them. That's got to be horrible for the child to go out that way. And the questions and the dilemmas about that just keep piling up. The other thing that I would wonder is that whether some people would do this, and it seems so extreme, but that there are people who would do this. There are people who say, well, we're going to die some horrible way. Here, let me kill my loved one so they don't have to endure the pain. And then I'll do myself in. So, that's another thing that could have happened. I don't know. I've never really read that that's what happened, but let's say we take this scenario outside of Titanic. I wouldn't put it past some people to think in that ways of seeing things. So let's switch over to the room with the stranger. This one for a lot of people would be like the easiest of the two choices. You don't have to see anybody, but when it comes to the stranger, the thing that I think makes it tough with that is not necessarily that other person, but who that person is kind of taking place for. Because let's say, you're not going to get to see your loved one. You're not going to get to see your child one last. Instead, you have this stranger taking their place, and you're going to die, wishing you could see them, wish you could tell them something, And that's going to be really, really hard for some people. Let's say you are in that room and you also had a child or a spouse on that boat. You don't know whether they got off, because you can say, well, I'm here in this room, dying, but hopefully my child is on a lifeboat. But you don't know that. So not only are you dying some horrible death with the uncertainty that your child or loved one might be dying in the room next door, you have no idea. Or maybe they fell off the ship, or maybe they were trampled by the rush of people to the top of the decks. There's no way to know. So you're dying an uncertain death. You don't know what's going on. That's got to be horrible too, right? So there's no easy answer to either one of these scenarios when it comes to the predicament of death. So let's move on to question number 2. What would you say to your either loved one or the stranger? What would be your final word? To your loved one? That's gotta be beyond. I mean, do you look in your child's eyes and say, everything's gonna be okay? Do you look at your spouse and say, I love you? Do you look at your parents and say, thank you? What do you say to the stranger? That one's gonna be a little bit harder too, because do you say, it's been nice knowing you, however long we've been trapped in this room? Or do you say, some word of encouragement like, death is only the start of this world? I don't know what you say in those circumstances, but, think about that. What would you say to, your child? What I would recommend is whatever it is that you would say to them, next time you see them, say it. Don't let that be the last chance, I have this feeling that so many people live life as though there's going to be a tomorrow, and you shouldn't. You should live life like you are sinking on the Titanic tonight, and you're not going to get another chance to say I love you or thank you or, everything is going to be okay. Don't let that happen. Now, this all leads to some overall thought that I have about the subject. When I try to think about if it was me, I'm not going to tell you which one I would pick, and I'm not going to tell you any of that things. I know. Seems kind of selfish that I would ask the questions but not answer them. Well, my show. But I do have some thoughts on the whole overall take on it, I guess. And that's in the fear, okay? Because look for some of us out there who are listening to this, you're going to say, well, I have no fear. I believe in God, and, God's going to take care of me. I wonder if at that moment, let's say you're at that corner of the room, there's just a small little pocket of air left. I wonder how many people would keep faith at that moment. Once the air is gone and the water rises, you're going to drown. I wonder how many people would be confident enough to say, yes, I still believe in God. And I wonder how many people would kind of question themselves. Did I do the right thing? There's got to be some doubt, and I don't fault anybody, who at that moment said, what, I'm not sure that I really picked correctly. Can you doubt? Can you blame anybody really if at that moment a little self-doubt comes creeping into the mind? I wouldn't hold that against them. I guess some people would say, well, you're abandoning your faith or whatever. But again, it's the unknown. Faith isn't about knowing for sure what's out there. Faith is about believing that you know what's out there. But you can't 100% point your finger and say, yes, I know this to be truth. But you believe in it. You say, I believe that there is something else out there after this is all said and done. Now let's look at the group that doesn't necessarily say, I believe in an afterlife or in a God or whatever it is. At that last moment, do they suddenly, try to find God? Do they say a prayer, hope that someone's listening? Or if you don't do that, what do you last say? What's your last thoughts going through your head? Oh my God, I'm dying. I don't want to die. Do tears, take over any emotion that you might have? That's a really complicated, kind of issue, I would think, For me personally, I'm not always the most religious person in the world. And so I kind of would go all over the place. I would have confidence in something else after this, but a little self-doubt would creep in. And at the same time, I would, do a little bit of bargaining with God. And then I think in the end, I would just accept it for what it is and, say, okay, well, I'm ready to find out what's going on after this, And those are the type of emotions that neither or any Titanic movie has ever really addressed. And for it to actually address these issues, it would have to be more than just a Titanic movie. It would have to be a movie that delves into the afterlife and, very choices about, who we are as people and the things we pick. It's not something that is disaster movie, romance, themed, fodder. It just isn't. So in thinking about the two movies, which one would I prefer? So let's go back to the whole, A Night to Remember. I think that A Night to Remember is a better movie than Titanic. And it actually has nothing to do with Jack and Rose. I have nothing against them as characters. But it takes away from what already is a very dramatic story. You don't need to be adding anything to it. When you start looking at the tragedy of it all, A Night to Remember is a much superior film because it doesn't have to add any of those gimmicks to make you follow along with the story. I mean, 1,500 people died. Is that not enough? Is that not enough tragedy for you? You don't need to add stuff to it. Now, that doesn't mean that I hate Titanic like some people do. I absolutely love that movie. It is one of those movies that in my lifetime was a shift in the types of movies that I liked and wanted to watch. It was a big deal. I remember going to see it like 6 times when it came out. It was a big deal, But in terms of when comparing it to A Night to Remember, it doesn't hold a candle. A Night to Remember is a much, much superior film. So let me kind of sum everything up, in today's show. Look, we're all gonna die, right? You, me, everybody is gonna die someday. We all hope that we get to choose how we're going to die, but death isn't guaranteed in what matter it's going to come. Sometimes it's going to come in unpleasant ways like on a ship. Other times it's going to come in a very pleasant way in our sleep. There's no way to know how we're going to go out. The one thing we do have in control though is some of the answers to the questions that I asked today about how do you want to go? Being surrounded by strangers or by loved ones, and what would be your last words to a stranger or a loved one. We actually have control over those type of things somewhat. I always say fill yourself and your life with those that you care most about. Try to surround yourself with loved ones, not with strangers who don't give a damn about you and what's going to happen to you. And then live your life that every single time you see your loved ones, the last thing you say to them, you're okay living, that was your final word. Whether it's because that's the last time you see them or they see you. Leave a memorable mark on the ones around you. Those are the type of lessons that I actually got from watching A Night to Remember. I know, crazy, right? You thought, he's going to talk about how we shouldn't be building boats that big, and what about this thing about man, thinking he's so great, but he's not. He's infallible, Well, yeah, I didn't get any of that. Instead, I got the fact that there's this whole crushing movie behind just that, exterior of a ship. There is this sadness that always weighs in my mind anytime I see or hear about the Titanic. A lot of people lost their lives in that, and a lot of people never had a chance. And so it makes me wonder what kind of choices those people had to make and what kind of choices they had to do and say. Well, now that I have completely brought you down for the day, I want to thank you so much for joining me on 365 Movies in 365 Days. And my name is Jose. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, all kinds of places, Facebook. You can also listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Switcher, or any place you get your podcasting feed on. I want to thank you so much for joining me. Like I said, if the only thing you took away from today's show is that you really need to be telling those that are around you that you love them, go ahead and do it. Tell them that you love them. Tell them that you miss them. Tell them that you're proud of them, or thank them for everything they've ever done. And then number 2, go out and watch A Night to Remember. It is a fantastic movie, and it's a movie that people should watch over Titanic. And if you've seen A Night to Remember, then go watch Titanic. But first, go watch A Night to Remember. Have yourself a great day no matter where you are or when you're listening to this. And until next time, thank you.
thank you